All right, we're continuing with Chapter 7, and the PowerPoint on Chapter 7 is, we're resuming with Slide 12. So we're talking about liberalism. So where realists tend to have a much more pessimistic view of globalization, liberalism, as you might expect, has a much more positive view of it. And so they argue that the government should refrain from interfering in the free flow of goods and services across the international borders. So they're going to be very quick to oppose tariffs or anything like that because, again, they don't embrace a zero-sum game mentality. In other words, they're not going to think, well, if we trade with China, we're going to lose. They think that if we do this, everybody wins. They call it a positive sum game, and it's the theory of comparative advantage. And basically, this says simply, America will produce what it uniquely can produce in the most efficient and cost-effective way, and Brazil does the same, and China does the same, and Puerto Rico does the same, and pick your nation. In other words, we all take advantage of each nation's advantages. I mean, that sounds redundant, but that we take advantage of what each nation is uniquely good at. In other words, can Americans in Minnesota produce bananas? Yes, they can. They can create greenhouses and we can get bananas. But if we were selling those on the open market in America, I mean, it would be almost cost prohibitive to buy a bunch of bananas. Whereas if you defer that to Costa Rica or some South American or Central American country, the product you're buying from them, the bananas, is that, could America do it? Yeah, but it makes a lot more sense to let a country whose climate is more amenable to that to do it. Yes, we're buying from another country, but you're going to get product a lot more efficiently and a lot cheaper if you do that. So that's this idea of comparative advantage and positive sum game. If you look at slide number 13, again, the slide says even when a country has an absolute advantage in the production of a good, they can produce it more cheaply than other nations, it still benefits that country by producing goods it can produce most efficiently, again, in comparison with other goods. And the example the textbook uses is Michael Jordan. Again, that's probably a little bit dated, but quite frankly, I personally think that Michael Jordan was the best basketball player that's ever been. I know people debate that, and you've got Kobe Bryant, and you've got other individuals, but the idea, pick your athlete, pick your elite athlete mowing their lawn. Can a Michael Jordan or any elite athlete mow their lawn better than you can? Yeah, probably, because for one, they're in much better shape, okay? And you're not in as good a shape as some elite athlete. But comparative advantage says that it's much smarter for someone like a Michael Jordan to do endorsements, to do commercial endorsements, or practice his jump shot, or play a game in which you're making millions or maybe even tens of millions of dollars in that 30-second or 1 hour segment than it would be to basically mow your own lawn. So another idea is comparative advantage says you do what you're good at and you can make the most money at, and you offload that to a 16-year-old kid who can mow your lawn for you and pay $15 an hour or $20 an hour. That's this idea of absolute advantage. Is that again? It's recognizing that perhaps the American economy would be much better producing silicon chips or something like that in Silicon Valley, or developing computers, than it would be trying to grow bananas in Minnesota, things of that nature. So the idea is that, and of course, comparative advantage and absolute advantage only works if you've got global trade. In other words, if you shut your country down to global trade, that's not going to work. So again, the ultimate example of shutting a nation down would be what they call autarky. The idea of autarky is if we embraced it in America, it would be we buy nothing but American goods. Okay, and again, as I was raised in a family where my dad was an executive in the car industry, and because of course I grew up with Buy American. In fact, to this day, I have never bought a foreign car, probably never will. However, the disclaimer is this: most made in American cars, if you actually look underneath the hood, you could actually check all the parts within that car throughout the car. A vast majority of the internal parts have been purchased offshore from another country. In fact, many cars that are made in America, most of the car is actually produced in another country, brought over here, and the last few parts are done in America so they can slap a made American sticker on it or something like that. In other words, it's to our advantage to do that. If we relied on exclusively American steel, American parts, American everything for a car, most of us couldn't afford them. It would be for the elite. So autarky is an extreme example of that. And probably the one country in the world that exemplifies this is North Korea. Again, I've talked about this in class. Their nickname is the Hermit Kingdom, because again, they've largely shut off goods and services from other countries, and they pretty much produce their own product. And if you look at the next slide there, slide number 15, it's got pictures of my little rocket man, Kim Jong-un of North Korea, and there's some kind of fun pictures I found. And I throw out the question to you, what consumer goods does North Korea export to the world? And it shows some products. Again, I can't think of any. The only product that I think North Korea has exported to the world is some form of arms trade, and most likely that's illegal. Okay, so in other words, they're probably the best example of autarky. And again, if you have the chance, you can go to Google and check this out. But if you type in shots of like satellite shots of Seoul, Korea at night, and then Pyongyang, North Korea at night, you can see the incredible disparity between the two nations. You know, South Korea is a democratic nation. It's open to global trade. It's a free country. North Korea is a dictatorship. It's communistic. It is an autarky. And you can see where so large segments of North Korea at night are just completely dark. And so it's just kind of interesting there. If you continue on there with slide number 16, you can see where liberals believe that that trade leads to absolute gains for all countries. And so they see international relations as a positive sum game where everyone who participates benefits. Again, think of your Kantian triangle, where you've got an international institution, you've got democracies, and then you've got the third angle of that triangle is some form of global economic trade. Okay, this idea that you don't, in the liberal system, you don't want tariffs, you don't want to get into trade wars, because again, in seeking to win by imposing tariffs on goods coming into that country, the argument that liberals make is everybody loses. In other words, for a liberal, they would say, let the car industry or let any American industry, I don't want to use the word die, but suffer and struggle if it cannot compete internationally. In other words, the thinking is, let other countries and companies overseas do what they do best. If American companies can't compete, then let them go out of business, because that brings better products into America. But then that also causes Americans and American companies to become innovative and create new industries. But again, of course, you're going to have this idea of offshoring, is you're going to have unemployment. And one of the challenges of that is, what do you do with a lot of low educated workers who only know how to work in an assembly line, and that particular factory gets offshored, gets sent off and offsourced to another country? If somebody doesn't have the type of education that allows them to adapt in that kind of environment, what do you do with them? Again, that would be more of a realist argument. Liberals think, well, listen, everybody wins and it'll all work out in some way, shape, or form. Other jobs would become available. If you shift gears now and you look at the neo-Marxist paradigm, again, neo-Marxism has its roots in Karl Marx and Lenin. They held that the exploitation of the working class would lead to some sort of communist revolution throughout Europe, where workers would rise to overthrow capitalism. Of course, that didn't happen because of a lot of the colonialism that occurred. It enriched the standard of living of a lot of the workers and prevented a lot of these revolutions. Again, a great example of that would have been Great Britain's control of India as a colony. Of course, they relinquished that as World War II was going on, and shortly after that. But Marxist's logic is that these workers are just going to get so disgruntled and so frustrated because the have-nots are going to look at the haves and want what they want, and so they're going to revolt against that. But again, the argument there on slide number 17 is that was mitigated by a lot of these, the mother country, again, take take England, that basically helped the Indian locals to have a higher standard of living than they would have had not Great Britain been involved in that country, so the people were generally content and they didn't revolt. So you can kind of take a look at that there. If you look at slide number 18, they see the global economy as a constant rivalry, economic rivalry between capitalist states, and they feel that the poor is always exploited, and so they don't see the comparative advantage and absolute advantage as working in favor of the worker. In other words, they don't see this trickling down benefit from advanced countries like the United States that perhaps trickles down to Sierra Leone in Africa, or pick your disadvantaged African country. They don't see these other countries benefiting from that. Whereas liberals will tend to view poverty and economic underdevelopment as a result of poor internal policy choices. In other words, liberals would say, listen, the issue is not what the Marxists say, where this is not trickling down. There's bad economic policy in these underdeveloped countries, and if they actually had adopted free market policies, if they got rid of their internal corruption, again, in a lot of these countries in Africa, in the global south, you've got corrupt dictatorships that pretty much take from the average person, and whereas the average person is struggling. So liberals say, listen, you get rid of that, and you're going to start kicking in, these benefits of global trade is going to kick in there. Marxists counter that and say, no, the problem is that poor countries are exploited by rich countries. They advance something called the dependency theory, which says that countries are poor precisely because they're the victims of covert or overt colonial rule. In other words, the Marxists will always, how do I say this tactfully, they lay down the victim card. They continually say these people are victims. And because they're victims, they're always going to be exploited. Where liberals would say, listen, they don't have to be victims. If they actually would have better internal policies, they could reap some of the advantages of international trade. So anyway, I'm going to stop there in this segment and pick up on slide number 20, talking about the Bretton Woods system.